At around 3:30 in the afternoon of November 5th, 2015, almost 8 years ago, the Fundão tailings dam in the small Brazilian town of Mariana burst, releasing a torrent of iron ore sludge which almost entirely submerged the downstream town of Bento Rodrigues under a river of mud. This toxic sludge made its way into the Rio Doce, one of the most geographically, socially and economically important rivers in the region. The dam collapse contaminated the entirety of the 853-kilometre long river, and the iron ore slurry made it all the way to the Atlantic Ocean 17 days later. It has gone down as the largest environmental disaster in Brazilian history. 19 people died, which, considering the untold scale of the disaster, was almost a miracle. But that is not to say that the human suffering was at all negligible. My name's Ewan Marshall, Deputy Editor of the Brazilian Report, and this is Explaining Brazil. If you like Explaining Brazil, you should subscribe to the Brazilian Report, the journalistic engine behind this podcast. We're an independent organisation funded by our subscribers, and you can help us stay independent and continue to produce award-winning journalism. And if you're already a subscriber, you can go the extra mile and join our Buy Me a Coffee fan page. And in return, you'll get exclusive perks like special newsletters and behind-the-scenes content, as well as a shout-out here on our podcast. And today, I'd like to thank our Buy Me a Coffee members: Tom Nolan, Marta Martins, Pam Ludwig, Leslie Seal, Caroline Hubert, Mark Hillary, John Thomas III, Louise Renz, Erwan Manais, Orlando Black, Steve Knapp, Aaron Berger, James Coney, Kars Vrieswijk, Alistair Townsend, Peter Abramson, Jim Awofadeju, Michael Fryer, Miller Renacido, David Dixon, Jose Ozzy Stankovic, Emerging Market Muser, Yarden Iftach, Tonika Thompson, Anderson da Silva, Kat Kramer, Peter Suffren, Anna Lund, and someone who wishes to remain anonymous. And our Buy Me a Coffee members come from all over the world, so please, if we are butchering the pronunciation of your name, do send us an email. If you too believe in the importance of independent journalism, and if you want to hear your name on our podcast, go to buymeacoffee.com/Brazilian Report and subscribe to one of the membership levels. Click on buymeacoffee.com/Brazilian Report to learn more. The burst Fundão Dam in Mariana was owned by Samarco, a joint venture between major Brazilian mining company Vale and the Anglo-Australian firm BHP. In the aftermath of the tragedy, Samarco was forcibly wound up for 5 years, but has since returned to operations in and around the region of Mariana. In 2016, Samarco, Vale and BHP signed an agreement with federal and state authorities in Brazil, pledging to set up the so-called Renova Foundation to coordinate and carry out compensation actions. But the hundreds of thousands of people affected by the disaster have yet to receive proper redress. In 2018, international law firm Pogus Goodhead filed a case against BHP in the High Court of Manchester, England, on the behalf of more than 200,000 individuals and institutions. And now, the proceedings have turned into one of the biggest class action suits in history. To talk about the current state of legal comings and goings, today we're going to speak to Tom Goodhead, Global CEO of Pogus Goodhead, and who is currently litigating the case against BHP. Tom, you first filed the claim in November 2018 at the High Court of England and Wales, and that request was denied based on jurisdiction. And then in July of last year, there was a ruling that the English court did have jurisdiction to try the case. So what were the grounds for that decision to allow the case to proceed in Britain, and how has BHP tried to push back against that?
Yeah, so there are a number of different grounds that the Court of Appeal found that the case should proceed in England on. The first was something that we had been saying all along, which was that there's no such thing as an unmanageable case. The sheer number of claimants, there were 200,000 back then in 2022. There are now over 700,000. That's not a good reason that a case shouldn't be allowed to proceed in England. The English courts are equipped to cope with cases of any scale at all. So that you can't just say that a case can't proceed because it's too big or too complicated to be tried. So that was one of the things that was held. Another was that it just simply was incorrect to say that the case was what you would call an abusive process, or that in fact that there was adequate redress available in Brazil or outside of court, such that the case shouldn't be allowed to proceed. The Court of Appeal, found unanimously in that sort of 107-page long judgment that the vast majority of the claimants had only received very modest amounts of damages. In this case, that hundreds of thousands of people had received nothing at all. That delay was caused really as a result of these sort of inappropriate applications that had been made by BHP in order to delay the proceedings, and that it couldn't possibly be said that it was pointless and wasteful to allow the proceedings to continue. The court acknowledged that there was a real and legitimate advantage for the claimants in being allowed to proceed with the action in England.
And we'll definitely circle back to cover a lot of the points that you mentioned there. But one of the more recent developments we've seen in Brazil has been BHP's attempts to include the Brazilian firm Vale as a co-defendant in the case that it is ultimately convicted. How does that work? Is it possible that we will see Vale being made a co-defendant?
Yeah, so it is possible, and they're likely to be. I think it's probably more likely than not that they will be brought to the case in England. But that's an argument between BHP and Vale. The claimants aren't suing Vale in the English proceedings. That's basically saying BHP saying, well, look, if we're liable, then Vale, you've got to pay 50% of the bill. Effectively, that's what they're trying to do. And BHP have also said, they said openly in court that Vale's presence, they believe, would increase the chances of this case perhaps being resolved through negotiation rather than needing it to go to trial. Now, we're always cynical, and I think my clients are always cynical about anything that BHP does in this case, because it's been going on for 5 years. The disaster was nearly 8 years ago now. And so there's always a cynicism that my clients express to me, which is a fear that basically anything like this is just another attempt by BHP to try to delay the case even more, because there was an attempt earlier in the year to put off the trial until, indefinitely, and at a minimum in July 2025. And the court rejected that. And the trial is going ahead in October 2024. But I think there is quite a lot of cynicism, perhaps, about the bringing of Vale to the claim in England.
And one of the things you mentioned in your first answer about the claim for jurisdiction was the possibility for redress in Brazil. Now, BHP are saying that the English case is a duplication because there is already the Renova Foundation here in Brazil set up by Vale and Samarco to carry out the compensation programs. So why would you say that compensation is inefficient, and why was bringing the case to the English courts necessary?
Yeah, I mean, it's just bullshit. Basically, is what they say constantly. I mean, I'll give you a practical example. Right, the people that had no access to clean water for anywhere between 1 week to 6 weeks, give that range depending on where they lived in the Rio Doce. They were being offered compensation by the Renova Foundation of 1,000 reais, around 1,000 reais, which is about $200, I think, depending on where the exchange rate is. There were subsequent court decisions in Brazil which offered 2,000 reais per day compensation, which, so, some people in Brazil had received, 1,000 reais from the Renova Foundation. Their next door neighbors might have received 20,000 reais as a result of a court decision. So 20 times greater than what was being offered by the foundation. We've gathered data of over 500,000 of our clients here now. And we've also had people like Kroll, the University of Sao Paulo, FGV, experts from there analysing the losses and looking at the average level of losses across the cohort, and the average number that we had come up with on our calculations was around 120,000 reais per person, and that's taking into account all of their socioeconomic damages, their sort of what we call the material and moral damages as well. And so, the Renova Foundation is basically what we call a liability shield. It was set up by the BHP and Vale pursuant to a court settlement in Brazil, something called the TTAC in 2016, which was homologated, but then was effectively sort of nullified through a judicial procedure in Brazil. And that was done with the mining companies and their very expensively paid lawyers, really sort of working the mechanisms of judicial, the institutions of justice and others in order to try to cap the liabilities. And that's why we call it a liability shield. They said, oh, well, it's all been fixed. Here it is. And by paying people, effectively what would be pennies on the dollar in terms of what the levels of settlements are. It's something they keep on saying, oh, well, full redress. But you can say that, as long as you're blue in the face. The reality is something completely different.
And one of the points that I think a lot of people unfamiliar with the case will want to know more about is the sheer number of claimants that are involved here. You've already mentioned that 200,000 at the beginning, and now there's well over 500,000. So who are these claimants?
Yes. So, over 700,000 people signed up by the end of February 2023. They are, basically people from all walks of life along the entirety of the Rio Doce basin. So they range from people who were former inhabitants of Bento Rodrigues, the village that one of the villages destroyed by the collapse of the Fundão dam, to members of indigenous communities, to fisher folk, to ribeirinhos, to members of quilombola communities, to former workers in Samarco, to people that own posadas, to people that sell fruits by the side of the road, to basically people from all walks of life, as well as Brazilian municipalities, hundreds of businesses, to public utility companies, to churches. So I always say for example, British listeners or American listeners, you imagine a city the size of something like Leeds or Sheffield in the UK, or you think of somewhere a big US city. Then that's the scale of this case, and everybody from people that are people in jail, from the homeless to super wealthy people, have participated. It's an entire society basically, that have brought these claims.
Yeah, so you have everyone being affected in different ways.
Yeah.
And so the total being requested at the moment is £36 billion. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, that's correct.
And is that the biggest class action case in the courts of England and Wales?
That we're ever aware of, both by volume and of the number of people participating, and by value. And that doesn't give me any pride. That's just indicative of the scale of this disaster. It was the largest environmental disaster in Brazilian history, and sadly, Brazil is a country I love, and I'm sure listeners to your podcast do as well. But it's also a country which is blessed by the natural resources curse of both having extraordinary levels of natural resources, but then also extraordinary levels of environmental degradation as a result of the extractive industries, and then so. Mariana is one of a litany of environmental disasters over the decades, but by its scale, it's the worst by a long way.
And if we can just circle back quickly to the Renova Foundation, BHP claim that they have spent about 30 billion reais already on redress and compensation. Will that play into the decision of this case? Would the English courts consider what has already been paid in Brazil when it decides on the final reparations?
Yeah, I don't, disbelieve them. They have spent billions of reais. That the foundation has, and that's money that comes from ultimately from BHP and Vale and Samarco. But it's a drop in the ocean of the true cost of remediating this disaster. The Brazilian public prosecutors estimated the cost at 155 billion reais back in 2016. And of course, inflation has been running at the rate that it runs, or interest the rate that it runs in Brazil, 10-12% per year since then. So yes, they may well have spent 30 billion, but 7 or 8 years later, they've probably spent less than a fifth of what the true cost of at least trying to remediate this this disaster is. So, I mean, that's not something to be proud of. That's actually, it's an embarrassment that's all that has been expended. But as so far as it relates to this case, then people can't be paid twice for the same losses, right? So if they have already received some compensation, depending on the nature of it, then they would offset that against whatever they would recover in the scope of the English class action. But I mean the number doesn't. I think it shouldn't be something which the Renova Foundation or BHP take any credit for having expended. It's far less than should have been expended.
And Tom, just before we finish off, what message do you think should be sent to BHP and Vale in the wake of these proceedings?
I just think the thing is that, this case itself has been dragging on since 2018. You mentioned November 2018. And that was 3 years after the disaster. We're coming up to the 8th anniversary this year now. Something that we say is, we don't bring this case because we want to be bringing it, right? It's not something which brings pleasure to be dragging out legal proceedings of this scale and nature. It would be far better for all of those involved to be able to try to resolve things with BHP, with Vale, with others, and to be able to move on with their lives. Like I don't recommend litigation to anybody, but it's got to be on a basis which at least approaches a fair measure of what was lost and what remediation work needs to be done in the future. And it's not just monetary, it's also an acceptance and admission of fault and what went wrong and looking at conduct in the future. So something I always say when given the opportunity to media outlets or anywhere else I say publicly is, it's time for BHP to do the right thing, basically, and Vale as well, and to try and bring this to a close through sensible negotiations in order to allow people to move on. And I think that if they truly believe what they say about being good corporate citizens and the ESG values that they espouse, etc., then that ought to be what happened, and it hasn't happened yet.
Thanks, Tom. That was excellent, and we'll be sure to be in touch again soon. And if you'd like more background on the Mariana disaster, be sure to check out all of our articles on Brazilian.report. If you like Explaining Brazil, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you get your podcasts. It only takes a second and it'll help us reach a wider audience. Or better yet, subscribe to the Brazilian Report, the journalistic engine behind this podcast. We have a subscription-based business model, and your memberships fuel our journalism and keep us going and growing. Thanks to our subscribers, we have been able to cover Brazil and Latin America extensively, and our work has won and been shortlisted for several international journalism awards. More recently, our newsletters won the Best Newsletter Prize in the Americas from the World Association of Newspapers and News Publishers for a small or local newsroom. And in order to keep doing that work, we need your support. So go to Brazilian.report/subscribe. I'm Ewan Marshall. Thanks for listening, and Explaining Brazil will be back next week.